Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Inside Story on Goldster. I'm thrilled this week to interview Stephen Barker, who I've been waiting to interview for a few months, and this is his new book, The Flying Sikh. It's a biography of a World War II fighter pilot. I'm actually going to let Stephen tell you all about it himself, but his name is Hardeep Singh Malik, and his story has not been told. Because I said World War II. I said World War II. Did I say World War II? World War One. It's a terrible introduction. World War One pilot. His story has not been told for 100 years. And here is Stephen telling the story of this man whose story really needed to be told. I should have let Stephen introduce himself because he wouldn't have done that terrible fluff up. So welcome, Stephen.
No problem.
It's really good to have you on here today. How did you discover Hardeep's story?
Thank you very much, Lucinda. Lovely to be here. I'm a museum consultant and I design exhibitions, and about half of my work relates to military heritage, particularly the First World War. And over the last decade, I've been working with museums on particularly exhibitions related to the centenary of the First World War. But there were events before that period and there are events ongoing now, and my work relates to a lot of that. And one of my key principles embedded in the work was to diversify the way in which the story of the First World War is known. Many of us are familiar with the First World War. We know about the trenches, we know about the mud, we know about the rats, the endless poetry. And what we don't know about is the war in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Africa, in Gallipoli, and so on. And it was a true world war, but we often see it through a very narrow lens. And once you start to explore those greater diversities, then you start looking for case studies. In my case, I'm looking for people whose stories resonate in those places, and in particular, stories that resonate from empire. And when you're talking about empire, significantly, you're talking about India. And people today have really lost the contact with India and able to appreciate just the sheer scale of that heritage and history, which is with us to this day. So when I'm looking through the archives at the India office, or the former India office at the British Library, I started to come across stories of Indians who were serving with the British Armed Forces, and one of them was Hardeep Singh Malik. So
he's somebody, I mean, he's a very charismatic looking man. You look at this photograph here, this could look like kind of the present day. There's something very compelling about his face. When you first started coming across him, did you think this is the story I'm going to tell, or did you have lots of stories and then Hardeep kind of won out? What was the process by choosing him specifically? Because you must have found so many people who would be worth writing about.
When you're looking at India, actually there are so few Indians stories have been told. Malik isn't typical.
Are they few stories that have been recorded, or?
Yeah, there are very few that have been recorded. Many sepoys, Indian soldiers, were illiterate. Malik was one of the few who was literate and whose story had been told. And the reason that I chose him was that I'd known about the story actually before the research, but it was mainly through online. And I knew that he'd written a memoir that was only published in India, but I had some access to that. But the key moment for me to decide to write about him was that when I was carrying out research about another theme within the British Library, within the old Indian Office archives, was that there was a file about him personally, a significant file, a large file, and in that was a political theme that he was a test case for. And what that was about was Malik, although he never knew it in his lifetime, was, if you were an officer if you were a person of colour with officer potential in the First World War, you could not join Britain's armed forces. And for all sorts of reasons, Malik was chosen to be an officer. And the unique circumstances of his enlistment that I discovered told a much bigger political story, and he's actually name checked at the highest levels of government in 1919, 1918, in telegrams that are going back and forth between London and Delhi. And that was the key moment. His personal story had more or less been told in the memoir, but there was this huge story, geopolitical story about the relationship between India and Britain that needed to be told. And he was a fantastic case study in that.
So tell us about his life before the First World War.
Yeah, he grew up in what is now the Pakistani city of Rawalpindi. And most people who I talk about Malik assume that he was from a well-off family. They were not. His father was a builder and a contractor. And Rawalpindi was the biggest military base in the empire before the First World War, bar none. And as a result of that huge expansion, Malik's father received huge amounts of money, significant amounts of money. And because he was not well educated, his father, Mohan Singh Malik, educated his 3 sons within the British educational school system, both in Rawalpindi, and then when Hardit Singh Malik went to Britain in 1908 as a 14-year-old on his own. That was the weight and importance that his family had put on the sort of formal British education system. So in Britain, he attends Eastbourne School on the south coast, and he's very talented. He's academic, he's sporting, and he eventually makes his way to Balliol College in Oxford in 1912.
Yes, when I started reading this, I came across the word Eastbourne. I thought, really? And it made me smile that there is this connection. It is incredible when you think, I mean, it happened all over the world, wasn't it? Parents sending their children to different parts of the world to be educated. It seems absolutely extraordinary today to think of sending a boy so far across the world to another completely different country. Do you think that made him the kind of incredible person that he was? Do you think that experience as a child of being sent away from his home so young, having to learn to survive in a different country?
Yeah, I think the key part of that question is that he had agency, is that his older brother, Tej, had gone to Britain 3 years earlier. And young Hardit, as a 13, 14-year-old, wanted to follow in his footsteps. And his parents rowed about it, actually, about whether he should go. His mother was totally opposed to it. He was going at a younger age than his elder brother had gone. And father, however, valued the sort of people who were self-made and who were independent and who could manage themselves. And he felt that his son was that sort of person. Just to check that he was, he asked that Hardit Singh, as a 14-year-old, make all the travel arrangements himself, which is no mean feat to get yourself from Rawalpindi down to Mumbai, and then Mumbai across the Mediterranean, up through France, and into London. And I suppose the only easier part of that, which your listeners might like to know, is that no passports before the First World War, none at all. So he didn't have that to do. As a condition of him travelling, father makes the condition that he must make all the arrangements himself. Hardit is the agent in that decision. It's not that he is being forced abroad. He wants to go. And he's also been brought up in the Anglo-Indian community in Rawalpindi. He plays cricket against Anglo-Indians. He's educated by Anglo-Indian tutors in Rawalpindi. And he's completely at home with that type of academic and also social environment.
And how did he find being in the UK?
He found it overall a very positive experience. He occasionally experienced racism. He talks about it in a Hindi interview in 1982, 3 years before his death, and said there were occasional petty instances of racism. But he said, I have so many English friends and so many positive experiences that actually they overwhelm the occasional negativity. I think that one of the key things that happened was that, unlike most Indian students, and there's about 2,500 Indian students in Britain before the First World War, is that he had gone to attend a British public school. And that was excellent immersion before going to a British university. Many Indian students who arrived at 18 going to Balliol or to any of the Oxbridge or Redbrick universities, they found it a struggle because they found British students not quite as serious as the Indian students. And that was because of their public school background, that the whole student was valued at a public school. So team player, banter, sports, that sort of emphasis, that was completely foreign to academic Indian students. And one of the reasons for his success is that he becomes acclimatized with the sort of, dare I say it, old Etonian attitudes prevalent before the First World War, which occasionally we see today, smashing up restaurants and so forth. And it took him a while to become acclimatized. He totally understood his peers. By the time that he got to Balliol, he got it. And other Indian students found it very difficult. And many of the problems that Indian students had coming from Indian universities straight into British universities, and it ended up with many of them becoming very alienated because they did not get the lack of seriousness of homegrown students. But of course, that was valued by British parents at the time.
So what led him to become a World War I fighter pilot? What was his journey to there?
Well, everyone assumed that he was officer material when they met him. He's a person of quality, he's very articulate, he's very well educated. But according to British military law of the time, anyone of colour could not be enlisted in Britain's armed forces above the rank of sergeant, and even then only in limited numbers. And as a result of trying to enlist, including even at Balliol College, where he was, and in fact he was on his own, isolated, because his peers, of course, had all gone off to join the war. The officer class of Oxbridge, he was alone at Balliol. So he tries to enlist. There are no opportunities because of his colour, and that's entirely what it's about, the colour bar.
Did you find actual official references to that to show?
No, that's through his memoir, because in the recruitment practices of the time, if they were not going to recruit you, there's nothing written down. There's no paper trail that you can follow. Recruiting sergeant will say, sorry, they might make noises that they did to him, according to Malik, that he could go and join a hospital as an orderly. That might be a better. Yeah. He wanted to join the war. His friends had gone to be officers, and Malik was not having any of them. And it's also worth stating that he was a British subject. He was a British subject, a proud Indian, and he wanted to fight on behalf of Britain's armed forces while he was in Britain.
And did he always know he wanted to be a pilot? Did he have any flying experience?
No, he absolutely didn't. He wanted to join the army at first, and then, to cut a very long story short, his tutor at Balliol is a chap called Francis Sligger Urquhart, and your viewers might to know he was one of the models for Mr. Samgrass in Brideshead Revisited. A very, very popular man at Oxford before, during, and after the First World War, who actually tutored Evelyn Waugh, actually. And what's important about Sligger is that he's on the management board of the French Red Cross, fluent French speaker. And another member of that management board is David Henderson, the head of the Royal Flying Corps. And the two steps to it. So first of all, Sligger enables Malik to join the French Red Cross, and Malik takes an ambulance down to Cognac, which is dealing with literally tens of thousands of casualties from the Verdun battlefield, and Malik is involved in that, in moving these terribly wounded men around. The important thing is that Sligger Urquhart from Oxford has made him an officer, and as such, at Cognac, he's able to go into the French officers' mess, and he mixes with French colonial officers, French national officers from all over the world. And in that environment, something important happens. Summer of 1916 is the period of the great fighter aces of the First World War, and the great fighter ace of France that everybody is talking about, is on everyone's lips, is Georges Guynemer. And because of that, Malik is a young guy, and all these young guys are talking about these, these knights, these princes of the air, as they've been spoken about. And it lightened the mood in Britain and France that there was somebody, there were these individual heroes. And Malik latches on to Georges Guynemer, and now, like a lot of young guys, I'm going to join Royal Flying Corps, or I would like to join the Royal Flying Corps. I'd like to be a pilot. Of course, he's in France, and he's given a hint, because he's mixing with French Flying Corps officers, he might join the French Flying Corps. And he writes back to Oxford and says to his tutor, Sligger, I'm being given this offer. And Sligger, as a proud Brit, writes to David Henderson, who's a fellow member of the management board of the Red Cross in London, and says, this is crazy. We have got a British subject, and the French are going to allow him to fly with them. And as a result of that connection, Malik is then given an invitation and is given an interview for the India office and the Air Ministry at the highest level of those organizations. And it's through that link that he's put back to Britain and enabled to enlist not one of 5 Indian pilots to enlist in the autumn of 1916. And just finish this little bit off. The reason that those 5 pilots are enlisted is that Britain is running short of pilots and navigators over the Somme battlefield of the summer and autumn of 1916. And the threat from Trenchard, who's head of the Royal Flying Corps, is that Britain's going to lose the war if it does not bulk up the number of pilots. It's as serious as that. And as a result of that, the colour bar is removed. And 5 Indians, including Malik, are taken on into the Royal Flying Corps.
And so France obviously did not have that colour bar at all during the First World War.
Well, that's such a good question. They did, but it was far easier, particularly within the French army, for colonial officers from Algeria, let's say, or Senegal, or Tunisia, or wherever, to actually become an officer. The colour bar was far more porous than the British colour bar, so you did find officers of colour far more prevalent in the French army in particular. But de facto, there was still a colour bar. Any French officers of colour would have said, you're ridiculous, there is a colour bar de facto, by the way we're treated, by the way we're kept out of command decisions. Right. So there's still a colour bar, but they were able at least to take on that role.
And so once the British had finally decided that they were going to allow people to die for their country, and allow them, it's just ridiculous, isn't it? How hard people were trying to say, we'll fight for you, and they're saying no. It seems absolutely extraordinary. What happened to him after he'd been accepted? And did he keep in touch with the other 4 Indian nationals? Did he know them? What was it like for him in his world?
At the time, I think he became aware during the First World War that there were other Indians. And if you remind me, I've got a little story about that, of what happens when he's the Indian ambassador in 1950s. So yeah, he's aware of them, but there is no contact between the Indians because they're all in different squadrons. And each squadron is a completely different entity in a different place. So he fights in the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, more formally known as the Third Battle of Ypres, that autumn. He shoots down a couple of Germans, and he's in an amazing dogfight. He thinks he's in a dogfight with Richthofen's Flying Circus and the Red Baron, but he's actually in combat with another squadron which flies red planes. And in one particular dogfight on the 26th of October 1917 over Passchendaele, he has a life-changing experience. He's in a dogfight with another British pilot against 20 German planes. It is all hell let loose, and he just about manages to survive. His plane crashes after a while, after this 15-minute fight, which is an eternity in those times. And his plane has 450 bullet holes in it. And 2 of them have gone through his leg. And those bullets that go into his leg will stay there for the rest of his life, up to his cremation.
It's really amazing that he survived, isn't it? I mean, when you hear the statistics of the pilots in the First World War, such a small percentage of them survived, really. So he seems to have, had a bit of a charmed life in that way, thankfully. What did he do next? I mean, after the war, what happened to him?
After the war, he would like to continue with the RAF in India. New squadrons have been formed. The RAF, the Royal Flying Corps, was only formed in 1912, and during the First World War, squadrons are formed in India, mainly to combat problems on the northwest frontier. War ends, Malik wants to continue in the RAF, but initial schemes to allow Indians to take on officer status with the same status as British officers are reneged upon. They're no longer needed, Indians, and therefore British officer status is not going to be conferred to them, and the colour bar is reintroduced. Now, Malik, early in 1919, he returns home. And by the way, his parents have not seen him since he was 14, and he's now 23, going on 24. He arrives home, and he arrives home to a Punjab which is in turmoil. Indian sepoys who have seen what freedom looks like in other parts of the world are horrified to find that the British are doubling down on political restrictions, with the Rowlatt Act in particular. And what your viewers may know through watching the film Gandhi is that on the 13th of April, 1919, the Amritsar massacre takes place, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. And that's the day that Malik is married 150 miles away in Rawalpindi. Perhaps we can come to that in a minute. As a result of this turmoil that's going on, which results in the Amritsar massacre, there's no way that the RAF are going to allow a person of colour, and particularly a Sikh, fly over Punjab. And of course, Malik and his family did not want to do that either, to be bombing their countrymen, be strafing their countrymen. So what Malik decides to do with his new bride is to return to Britain. He can't be a pilot in India, but maybe he can continue to be a pilot in Britain. So he gets on a ship with his new bride. This tells you something about the passion that he has for serving with the British forces, with the RAF. And he gets on a ship. And the biggest frustration with the book was that when he lands at Southampton 6 weeks later, he has changed his mind. And I'll never know why. I don't know why he changed his mind, because he was passionate about when he left, but he's changed his mind. And he joins the Indian Civil Service, and then has a 30-year career and an amazing diplomatic career back in India. He becomes the first trade commissioner to Canada, one of the first high commissioners to the United States, and most importantly, finishes career. He's the first Indian ambassador to Paris, as a fluent French speaker, of course, appointed by Nehru after partition in 1948. He knew Nehru well. He was part of Nehru's government, therefore. But he spends 5-6 years as the French ambassador to Paris.
Fantastic. I mean, what an incredible life to have led. I mean, when you were researching him, so you spent time, as you said, in the British Library. Where else did you go for your research? Did you manage to go out to India? What kind of things did you discover? I know that you were in touch with his family. So
yeah, much of the information came from Malik's own family in Delhi and occasionally in Mumbai. And I'm so grateful for their trust in me to write a balanced story of Malik's life. So much of it came from there. I had his memoir, which he'd written.
Wow, hats off to Malik.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, he's everyone says that. Hats off to Malik. He's such a good chap. And he so he wrote a memoir. an Indian journalist called Somnath Sapru, who sadly died very recently in India during the COVID pandemic. He wrote a little bit about Malik and actually interviewed Malik in the late 70s and 80s, and you can see those on YouTube, some of those interviews if you're interested. But much of the contextual background to the Malik story, which really brings it alive for me as a historian, was in the archives at the British Library in a very thick file, which was being stored there, and which is about him and his importance as being a representative of what we might call the challenge to the colour bar. Because in 1918, 1919, his personal case is used to test the colour bar. He's one of the 5 Indian pilots that have been recruited. Malik in particular has a successful career, and he receives the gold medal in 1918 as the best Indian flyer. And as a result of that, his story is featured in the media, and he's used as this sort of test case, a propaganda figure to enable recruitment in India.
And
as
they
well.
reinstated the colour bar. So despite him being such a great success, they reinstated the colour bar. How deeply frustrating that should happen.
Yeah, it's yeah, I'll keep this short because it's such an important part, but a very long and convoluted part. One of the main, but Britain needs a lot of extra reinforcements during the First World War. It's running short of men after Passchendaele, and Lloyd George's cabinet, and all of this is into the papers, and this is where Malik's story comes in, is that Lloyd George's Imperial War Cabinet know that the war in March of 1918, it looks as though it's going to go into 1919, and they're starting to plan for 1920, and they're running out of men. And what your viewers need to know is that Britain is going to fight the First World War in 1919 with basically an army which is bulked up from India. They're going to recruit another 500,000 men in 1919 on top of 1.5 million Indians in the First World War. And Malik, so what the British government does, it needs to offer political sops to moderate Indians in Delhi who will get behind that recruitment drive. And as a result of that, the colour bar is lifted in some initial schemes, and officers of colour then start becoming full British officers, including Malik. As soon as the war ends, though, as you're saying, as soon as the war ends, they are not needed. And those schemes that are put in place in 1918 are reneged upon, and it causes fury in Delhi, because within the Indian civil service and also within the legal profession, there was relatively no colour bar. There is no colour bar. In the British Army, British Armed Forces, there are a colour bar. They reinstate it, and that is a running sore in India after the First World War. Things will never be the same after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Gandhi completely turns on his head, opposes British recruitment because he's been supporting it for the previous 4 years, and he turns his back to the British. And he's a very good example of the ways in which Indians start to turn. And it eventually leads, I would say, to what happens in partition and the Quit India movement in 1942 during the Second World War. The Indians have learned, you're not going to declare war on our behalf in the Second World War as you did in the First War. You're not going to treat Indian soldiers the same. And Gandhi really pushes, and of course, the Quit India movement is one of the things that leads to partition.
Good. Yes. No, not saying that necessarily everything that's happened since as a result of partition is good, but the fact that people got so, rightfully angry about the fact that this is appalling. So we used all these people and then reintroduced a colour bar. And we've had a comment in the chat as well saying it's absolutely disgusting and it seems frustrating. Did you come across documentation of that in your research, of the actual physical decision? That was there a memo or anything, a discussion that literally said we're going to reintroduce this, or was it just
no? It's fascinating. They're dry, very dry documents. The evidence is dry, so there's no sense of a volte-face in the document. So there's a discussion. There's long discussions that go on between the India Office, which is the equivalent of the Foreign Office today, and the Air Ministry. And it's quite clear that there are very, very sympathetic, what we would describe as liberal politicians and administrators who want to make it happen. They think it's unjust. And the War Office is totally opposed to it. Because of the need to recruit Indians, the War Office has to take a back foot. And so the schemes that are come up with by the India Office and the Air Ministry are supported by the government of India in Delhi. But unfortunately, when the war ends, the War Office and the government of India, they are the ones that pulled the plug on it. And to answer your question directly, no, there is no sense of irony. They only admit that there's been a fault-fast in documents where the Secretary of State for India, who's a very liberal and has become my hero in this whole debate, Edwin Montagu, he is really pushing against any forms of discrimination. And the Air Ministry come back and say, yes, we know we went against our initial principles that had been set up during the First World War. But they basically say, oh, but things have changed now, and we no longer lead them. Of course, they have to do another volte-face in the middle of the 1920s because Indians are beginning to turn on them politically, and Britain is weakened after the First World War, politically, militarily, financially, and the end, although it takes another 20 years, is looming. And of course, eventually the Second World War, Britain is totally weakened, and there is no way that they can hold on to India. The seeds of what happens in partition in 1947 are sown during the First World War.
Yes. So when you look back in history, I mean, as a historian, you just look at what's happening today, and so frequently you think we can trace that back 100 years or 50 years or 150 years. It's so deeply frustrating.
You can. Yeah, exactly, Lucinda. Yeah.
So you're a museum consultant. Let's just go to that quickly. What does being a museum consultant involve before we come back to Malik?
Yeah, I've been self-employed for 13 years. I mainly make a living out of it by making funding applications for projects on behalf of museums, universities, libraries, and archives. Those funding applications are usually to the Heritage Lottery Fund, the Arts Council, Arts Humanities Research Council within universities, and they're usually for a variety of forms of exhibitions. And occasionally I'm fortunate enough to be able to build myself into those projects as part of the application. So that's an important part of my work. It's sort of 4/5 of the income that I earn, but I also have a guided tour, battlefield guided tour project, which I run continually and deliver public lectures. And those two together make, I'm doing 60 events at the moment in the forthcoming year, lectures and battlefield tours, mainly in Britain, but also in Europe. And the third element is that I work on strategic commissioning with groups of museum trustees and map out visions, strategic development, and so forth.
We've had a lovely comment here. This Sunday at the Memorial Roundabout in Eastbourne, I will remember Malik. Eastbourne College, the public school, has produced quite a few well-known individuals, such as General Sir David Richards, Chief of the General Staff.
That's true. That is very true. Thank you for that comment.
You're doing in Bristol on the 19th of November. So that's very soon, actually. So this, I'm just going to put a quick link in the chat here, everybody, if you want to go along and hear Stephen talk. It's at the Friends of Bristol Museums. So going back to Malik, how did you get in touch with his family? How did you discover about his memoir? And what led, you said it took them a couple of years before you were able to kind of, get them to understand that you would be the right person to write this book. How did that work?
Yeah, just there was some conversations that had to be had. Actually, I'm grateful to my colleague Shravani Basu, who is the writer Shravani Basu.
Read her here on Goldster. She's wonderful. I know her
excellent.
well.
Yeah, well, Shravani is a friend of mine, and she, in her book about the First World War, had trodden the Malik path in a little theme about him, based on his memoir. and she was willing to enable me to make contact with Malik's family. And then after a number of conversations, Shrabani was willing to, Malik's granddaughter was willing to work with me and to allow me access to his archive.
Excellent. Although we interviewed Shrabani here, I'm trying to think when, last year, I think, about the mystery of the Parsi lawyer. If those of you who've been with Goldster for a while will remember her coming on. And of course, she also wrote Victoria and Abdul, about Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim. So she's a fantastic author. I love her books. So when you got in touch with them, did they think, who is this chap? Do we want someone writing about our family history? Or were they very, very keen to think Malik's story needs to be told?
To be honest, we've not had that conversation. I think my sense was that they just wanted to Sancha Malik, who's Malik's granddaughter, she just wanted to talk to me, and she just wanted to know what my purposes were and what the themes of the book were going to be. And I think I had to reassure, I was trying to be as reassuring possible. There wasn't a smoking gun in terms of something that would have damaged his reputation, sort of reputation he had. But what I had got, I was able to reassure her, really added to the story. And as a historian, I'm a great believer in following the evidence, first of all, and also going back to the time of the events and using the interpretation that people had then from that point and explaining that. I was able to offer that reassurance, and I'm so grateful to Sancha Malik and the Malik family.
And so what were your favourite discoveries that you made while you were researching this?
It may not be an exciting answer to this, but I've been studying the First World War for 35 years, and you know, I've got three of my grandfathers fought, and one of them was maimed, one was killed, and I sort of, you know, so I'm interested in the First World War, and what was of interest were not the personal stuff actually, but as a historian, it was my excitement. I wasn't hopping around in the British Library, but I was terribly excited by what I was finding, which connected Malik's story to the wider story of the conduct of the First World War. And it was those telegrams and the correspondence that was going on between the War Office, the Government of India in Delhi, their ministry, and the India Office that really excited me. Because Malik, although he never knew it, he was being name-checked in telegrams on a regular basis between Delhi and London, and that excites me. And of course, you know, a lot of the personal stuff is really interesting. Suddenly, you've got a figure who connects to the wider war, and you know, and because he is understandable and sympathetic to audiences both in Britain and South Asia, he's a fantastic vehicle. I deliver lectures about Malik. There is universal sympathy for the sorts of things that we've been discussing today from people from all sorts of backgrounds, and he's an excellent vehicle for understanding and carrying forward our understanding not only about Britain's relationship with India, but India's contribution to the First World War.
And so this book was actually published initially in India, wasn't it? I mean, I know it's only just come out here, but it was published first in India. How's it been received in India?
Really well in India. Yeah, as I mentioned to you earlier, I've done 20 odd interviews with Indian media about it, and it's selling really well. They came out at more or less the same time, both in India and here. And yeah, it's selling really well. Lots of interest in India about the First World War. It's a sensitive period for Indians. It's a controversial period because many Indians at the time, and certainly now, believe that maybe Britain wasn't an ally, maybe it should have been the enemy. But something that was beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But it's a huge interest in it.
And so it's got a different title, hasn't it? Do you want to tell us about that? Because you have an agent in Delhi. don't you,
Yeah,
Ron?
I have an agent in Delhi, and when we were talking about the initial title came about with the British publication, which is The Flying Sikh. And when we were talking about the title, that was a non-starter because in India, universally, Flying Sikh is only one man, and it's not Hardit Singh Malik. It's a chap called Milkha Singh, who also sadly died during the recent COVID epidemic. And Milkha Singh is India's most famous Olympic athlete. I think it may have been 68 or 72 that he won a medal for India, India's first medal. And as a result of that, he was given the epithet Flying Sikh. So anything, on Instagram or Twitter, hashtag Flying Sikh is only Milkha Singh. You can't have that book associated with it. So you'll know the film Lion, that wonderful film, Lion. Yeah. So of course, the next thing, okay, we're looking for a title. So Lion of the Skies, with his name being Singh. Singh in Punjabi is lion. Singh and lion is the translation. So that was a good title, and everyone was happy with it in South Asia.
So and you've got both books there, haven't you? And they look identical except for the title, which
I'll just really... Oh, there's the it's the same cover. Yeah, the Indian publisher really liked the British cover. Wanted to use it, and it's a really nice cover, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's a really lovely cover, and as we both know, you don't always get a beautiful cover, and it's wonderful when the designer really comes up with something that you love, and you don't have to kind of have a battle about it. It's always wonderful if they can do that. So have you ever had any issue with writing about a Sikh without being Sikh yourself?
Not really. The only time it's come up is on a couple of those aforementioned Indian interviews. I've been asked why, quote, a Britisher is writing about an Indian story, what is ostensibly an Indian story. And I have two answers to that. One, that Malik was educated in Britain, and the whole of the story is underpinned really by records which are held in Britain. And he had a very strong affinity with Britain and huge numbers of British friends. So a Britisher writing the story is entirely appropriate. And as I also said, trying not to sound glib about this, there's been 100 years to write the story in full and to research it. And I wasn't crowded out by other people at the doors of the British Library, by other people trying to write the same story. So
you weren't stepping on anyone's toes by doing it.
No, there wasn't a crowded rabble going to the doors of the India Office archives. No.
And so, have you been out to India? Have you been able to go out and do any talks or anything there?
No. The sad part, of course, is that it was in the offing, but with the COVID pandemic and the problem, the difficulties in India, that wasn't possible. Yeah. So it's something that I'm looking to do maybe next year, because I'm still in touch with one or two particularly Indian military organizations, and they're keen to go ahead and do that. So I'll probably do that at some point.
So we've got a question here about your event for Bristol Museums. Any chance of buying a ticket, and is it being screened or recorded for those of us far away and shielding? I did put the link to the event in there actually, so that should show up with all the details.
I don't know. It's not. I've not dealt with the Friends of Bristol Museums before. Best to contact them through their website, I think. And as you say, you put the link in.
Yeah, there is a link. If you go down, there's a link to buying a ticket. It doesn't say about whether it's being screened or not, but I would chat to them about it. Thanks for your question. Yeah, so before we go on to me telling everybody what's coming up next, you said to remind you to tell a story of when Malik was ambassador in the 1950s. So what was that story about the other Indian pilots?
Yes, yeah, it's really charming actually. Is that there was another pilot called Walinka. I'll just refer to him as Walinka. And Walinka was shot down and killed in 1918, and was buried in France. And when Malik was Indian ambassador in 1953, it would be, he went to the Arras Memorial to the Royal Flying Corps. And what Malik must have known at the end of the First World War, he must have known that Wilinka had been killed, because when he went to the Arras Memorial, the names recorded on the Arras Royal Flying Corps Memorial are those whose bodies are missing, were never found. And Malik says that he went to that memorial and Wilinka's name was not on there.
Right.
Much to his surprise. So he got his some of his consular officials to look into it, and it turned out that what had happened was that yes, Wilinka had crashed, but he'd been taken to a German hospital and died of some terrible wounds, and had then been buried for the Germans. And during the period after the First War, Wilinka's family in Calcutta had asked a British military official to try and find where their son was buried. And it took a year and a half. And he'd basically been buried in a French military grave. And the British military official, got a long story short, found out that after the First World War, the grave had then been moved into another cemetery. And the British official was then given the go-ahead by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or the Imperial War Graves Commission as it was then, to disinter that grave. And by looking at the remains of the flying boots and one or two personal artifacts, they did prove that it was him. And he was then reburied in a British military cemetery, was Wilinka, in 1924. But what's nice about the story, from my point of view, is that Malik had not known that. He had only known that Wilinka was missing. And he then went to the grave to pay his respect. So it was like a story that had like moved on 40 years later.
And how lovely that he was still thinking of those colleagues and considering.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
I suppose that time in the war ever left them. I am just going to tell everybody what's coming up next, if you don't mind staying.
Yeah, of course.
And then when we come back, if you wouldn't mind giving us your writing tips, because we have quite a few people here on Goldster who are doing a Goldster writing course. And
yeah,
I'd
of course.
like to know about how you do your work. So just for a couple of minutes, I'm just going to tell everybody what is coming up on Goldster in the next few days. So on Goldster this week, tomorrow, I am interviewing a really fantastic, for Remembrance Sunday, I'm interviewing Tessa Dunlop about her books. Now, one of her books, of course, is Army Girls, but she's also got a new book out on Elizabeth and Philip, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. And she's just really wonderful. If you don't know Tessa's name, she's a broadcaster, does a lot of TV work. She's a historian. So we're steeped in history this week. And then next week, you're with Humphrey. And on Thursday, he's interviewing Tosca Lee, who is a beauty queen, a ballerina, a pianist, and she lives on a working farm in Nebraska and somehow has also managed to write 11 best-selling novels. She's talking about her latest one, a thriller called A Single Light. And then the following day, on the Friday next week, he is interviewing Maggie Piggott, who is a classic Goldster author, because she has written a book called How to Age Joyfully, 8 Steps to a Happier, Fuller Life. She's the vice chair of Open Age, Life's Just Begun, and has published this new book because she's just trying to say, you know, we don't have to kind of give up as we get older. And what I love is that Dame Judi Dench has given her a wonderful endorsement of this book. So we're going to come back to Stephen now. Stephen, what would you say are your top tips for writing?
Yeah, I think a couple I've been thinking about. The first thing, this is the second book I wrote, and in the past my time's been limited with working full time. So I like to try and find a way of working which guarantees that I'm going to get the book finished. And it's a simple thing that I did, both books, was to say that I would always write 300 words minimum of 300 words per day. And that has proved to be just such a good approach for me personally. It's not for everyone. I'm just plugging this in because it's become unplugged. There we are. That's better. 300 words a day works for me perfectly, because if you do that for 300 days, then you'll have 90,000 words. And I'm really strict on that and disciplined on it. So even at Christmas Day and Boxing Day, no excuses, no let off, 300 words. And of course, you write sometimes when you get a flow and things are going well, and you deliver far more than that. You know, occasionally you write 500, sometimes you write 1,000. So the books that I've written have been written in 6 months, but that basic 300, sometimes 300 seems interminably long and very difficult to write, but often it just feels like a really nice amount. And you know, because you've got the end, you know that if you do it, the end is in sight. And just 300 really motivate. I find it terribly motivating. So that's one.
And do you find you write better in the morning or the evening? Do you vary according to the plan of your day, or do you have a specific time that you have to sit down every day?
Yeah, I'm a morning person. I'm up at 6:30, 7 a.m, usually working from 7:30, 8 o'clock. And the best time for me is between 9 and 11, something like that. I'm hopeless in the evening. Don't even ask me to say anything sensible.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's been a real joy to interview you, and I hope that this book does really well. As you can see, very pertinent for this week, and good luck with it, and good luck with the event in Bristol. You're doing another event, right, next year in Birmingham. Tell us quickly about that before we go.
It's on March the 25th in Birmingham, the Tally Ho Centre near to Edgbaston Cricket Ground. It's the Great War Forum Conference. There's usually 200 or 300 people there, and I'm talking about Hardit Singh Malik.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, it's fantastic that you've brought his name back into prominence, and I think it's really brilliant that you've done this. So well done, and good luck with whatever project you're going to work on now. I know most writers don't like talking about their upcoming project, but whatever you're doing, I hope it goes well. And
thank you so much, Lucinda. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. And Stephen and I will turn our videos off now, and Ben or Joe will end the meeting, and I will see you tomorrow with Tessa Dunlop. Take care, everybody. Bye.